Hello, everyone, and welcome to the integration workshop or the integration experience. This is day one, hosted by myself, Ryan Hassan, and Matt Kay. A little bit about me, if you don't know, I'm co-founder at the Center for Healing Lived Experience with Addiction, Mental Illness, trauma, all of that kind of stuff, who went through my own journey of getting past that to now in a process the last decade or so of helping people recover in their own way from that. Myself and Matt started a modality or created a modality called Embodied Processing that we've been teaching now for, 4.5 years, maybe? We've been teaching that, which we've had well over 1,000 students come through now and hundreds of certified practitioners all around the world. It's a somatic modality. And we'll probably talk a little bit about that today because there's obviously an integration process when it comes with any type of healing modality or session or that kind of thing. So, Matt, really quick sort of 1 minute intro for you if you would like, and then we can get into things. You're muted, Matt. It's a great start.
Awesome. My name's Matt. I am the co-creator of Embodied Processing with Ryan and one of the head trainers, myself, Ryan, and Noel Harburger. As similar to Ryan, I have lots of lived experience living through addiction and trauma and navigating my way out of that. Then went on to, study AOD and counseling and all of that sort of stuff and work in private practice and became fascinated with somatic work and trauma. And out of that birthed everything myself and Ryan do. So that's part of our offering, and today integration, the way I'm going to speak about it is through the lens of embodied processing, how we see integration and how it correlates with somatic work as well.
Yeah, and
Uh,
so go for it,
sorry,
mate.
AOD is addiction and other drugs, or alcohol and other drugs.
Yeah. And so before we jump into a lot of the dot points and things we're going to talk about, we'd love to keep that chat box. And it's already really active and I'm loving that. So we want to keep it that way through the whole workshop. We would love to hear your experiences with integration or your ideas about it or what you've learned or what you want to know about, or maybe experiences that you've had in integrating, experiences that you've had in your life. Because as we move through the topics, we want to obviously tailor it to what you want. So if you want to share anything in that chat box, we're happy to touch on it and talk about it as well. So, first topic here, I guess we want to talk about, I guess before we jump into what integration is and why it's so important, the best place to start is probably why there is a need to integrate. Like, what are we integrating from? In order for us to have a requirement to integrate, we must have disintegrated at some point in our life, or fragmented is another word for it. Because integration is really a process of welcoming different parts of ourselves back into the whole, parts of us that we have possibly abandoned, or what we would call an orphaned part. So we might just start off by talking about the creation of those orphaned parts. And so we go through certain experiences in our life that we have trouble processing. We have trouble digesting. It's like a food that we've eaten that we can't properly digest. And the reasons why we can't digest an experience is because we go into heightened emotional states. We go into very dysregulated nervous system states. And we can call these traumas. We can call these emotional baggage, emotional imprints, samskaras. There's many different words for them, but they're kind of an experience that comes in through our senses that doesn't properly make it all the way through. We don't properly process it. And especially when we're young, we don't have the resources available for us to process a lot of these emotional events. And we might think of things like sexual abuse, physical abuse, car crashes, all of these very overt types of imprints or types of trauma. But it can be many different things. There's a whole spectrum of this kind of stuff. An example that Matt and I use in a lot of our courses is, it can be so subtle as we can say I'm in grade two at school and I'm kind of a bit of a shy kid and I don't share too much a lot of the time. But for whatever reason, I'm in class and the teacher's asking a question and I feel very confident that I know the answer to this question. So I put my hand up to share and they point at me and say, Ryan, go ahead. And whatever I say for whatever reason is very silly and the whole class starts laughing at me. And everyone's looking at me, everyone's laughing. And in that moment, my body goes into a very, very heightened state. I become very, very dysregulated. I have a lot of fear in my body, a lot of embarrassment, a lot of shame. And in that moment, the young me will then look around for any type of resource that I can latch onto, which we don't know it at the time consciously, but I'm trying to find someone or something to help me regulate and process what's happening in that moment. So I might look as a resource to my closest friends in the class and go, okay, maybe they're going to be the ones that, I can latch onto. But as I look at them, they're maybe laughing at me the hardest and encouraging everyone else to laugh as well. So they're not a great resource in that moment. I may then look at the teacher, the only adult in the room, and go, okay, that's a resource that I can latch onto. But maybe the teacher's laughing or the teacher's turned their back and they're not interested in me or helping me in that moment. So I'm left unresourced, dysregulated. My emotional state and my nervous system has opened up a survival loop and it has not closed that loop. It is remained open. Leaving that classroom that day, that loop will remain open. That imprint will remain unprocessed. If I then, after that event, can't find a stable resource as well, there may be nobody else at that school I can speak to, whether it's a counselor or another teacher that I've connected with, that may not be available. And then the most important one is that home environment. And that home environment may not be a place where I can be properly resourced, especially in terms of talking about emotions. For me, I was like many kids growing up in the 80s and 90s. I did have quite supportive parents, but one thing that we never spoke about was our emotions and what was happening internally. We would speak a lot about achievement and things that were happening externally, but I never really had that safe space to talk about what was happening emotionally. And because of that, never really had the emotional literacy, I guess, to even express what I was feeling. So if I then can't come home to my safe environment and properly close that loop, then that imprint and that loop remains open. How long does it remain open for? It can remain open for the rest of our lives, unless we do the work around closing it, sometime in the future. And just based on that one event, and the event that I've talked about may not be an imprint for some people, but it will be an imprint for others. That's I guess, um, one of the myths about these imprints or traumas. It is what is traumatic or what is an imprint for one person is going to be an imprint for another. That's simply not true. We're all having a very subjective experience. So from that day forward, when I don't close that loop, I can start to create stories, beliefs, narratives about myself and the world based on that experience that I had, all in the attempt to try and protect myself from that day forward. So in that moment, I may decide that it's not safe for me to speak up. Okay. And so that becomes now what we would call this orphaned part, who believes it's not safe to speak up. It's also coupled with the feelings of fear and shame and embarrassment, of being alone, of being abandoned. And so that sort of sits now, it's split off from our psyche or split off from our being. And now that orphaned part will, from that day forward, keep an eye out on our environment by using our senses to try and work out if any potential similar event is going to happen in the future. And when it does, it goes from being mildly hypervigilant to really overtly hypervigilant. And that can play out, decades in the future. I could be then in my mid to late 20s in a relationship and my needs aren't being met and I need to speak up and express those needs in relationship. And as soon as I go, all right, this is what I'm going to say, this is how I'm going to say it, and I go to walk into that room and talk to my partner, as soon as I go to speak, that orphan part becomes extremely active. All the fear, the shame, the embarrassment, the it's not safe to speak up, all becomes very, very active. 5 years, 10 years later, it can happen in a work context. I need to go knock on the door and speak to my boss about asking for something because I'm working really hard and I feel like I'm not being rewarded. As soon as I go to knock on that door, what happens? That imprint becomes active, that orphaned part. And so I pull my hand away from the door and I don't go in and express my needs. I abandon myself just like I was abandoned, or at least in my perception, in that originating event. And so integration is one. And unfortunately, we don't, as human beings, have one or two of these orphaned parts sitting out there remaining hypervigilant. We got dozens, sometimes hundreds, because we've been through all of these experiences that we weren't able to properly process. And so the integration process is really first understanding these orphan parts. We all have them. It's part of the human experience. Then what are the individual ones that I have to my life, and exploring out where in our life today are we stuck? Is it speaking up? Is it with money? Is it with family? Is it getting into the same patterns in relationship? Is it a low self-worth or low self-respect and self-esteem or feeling like I'm not worthy of love? And then using our life today to be a mirror to us and then exploring the roots of that. And that's where we do work like with embodied processing, with root cause therapy. A lot of the stuff that we teach at the Center for Healing is around starting to try and trace back and find the originating events where we had these moments. And that's where we understand where orphan parts were birthed or born. And then that starts a process then of working with those parts in an attempt to safely welcome them back into the whole. And that can be very different for people, different orphan parts. I've worked with clients where we've worked with the one part for months and months and months at a time. And then full integration doesn't happen for months and months and months after that. I've worked with people who've integrated an orphan part in one session and it was integrated a week later. We don't really have a blueprint you can't guarantee someone how long it takes these parts to come fully back. But that's the process. Matt, anything you want to add on the orphan parts or I guess the disintegration process?
Sure, I feel like you've covered the whole workshop in the
I went on
first.
a bit of a rant then, didn't I? I went off.
You did well. I thought, okay, he's
Yeah.
covered everything.
Okay.
Anything I say is just going to be repeating. No, you did awesome though. I think, the way you explained how orphan parts are created, it resonates viscerally, not just intellectually. I could see lots of people kind of nodding their heads as you were talking. And, by viscerally, I mean felt sense resonance. And, it's like, when we look at things like integration and fragmenting and trauma and all that sort of stuff, I find the more really fundamental questions are helpful, to understand, and it's like, what is it that disintegrates? And it's the sense of self, so then we can trace that inquiry, like, well, what is the self? What is it? Because it's something that we kind of just take for granted and normalize, we've all got this sense of self, but we never really look at what it is. And to really understand how the disintegration process happens and what happens when we integrate something, it's to like understanding what the self is really really helpful. And the self, it's an experience. It's something that we experience, and it's like if everyone here just tunes in to their own sense of self for a moment. So if we just all take a breath, just return to center and just feel into what it feels like to be you. Some people might feel it as just a core sense of I, the feeling of their own presence. And then we can have the mind come in, like, oh, I'm Matt or I'm Ryan or I'm Gemma or whoever and whatever our name is, and I do this and that. We might get a feeling, maybe in the heart or the belly. Different sensations might be associated with like the story of me. I'm Matt, I'm a somatic therapist. I own a dog named Sky. I've got 2 kids, married to a girl named Tara. And so then there's that narrative self, and then there's that felt sense of self happening together. And then there's obviously the observer of that, the sense of I that witnesses and is aware. So that question, like, what is me? What is it that I am? What is self? Can start to kind of bring us back to that sense of wholeness that we're looking for, like quite organically, just by inquiring. And so when we're disintegrated, it kind of means, that sense of self has just become split off and disowned aspects of itself and is in conflict with itself and has tied itself into a kind of big pretzel that is disjointed and it's lost its sense of wholeness, essentially. So if you can imagine a tree, like a tree grows, and we look at the whole tree, you can see the whole tree, and it has like I'm looking at a tree right now. It has certain branches that come off, um, that grow in certain directions. It's got certain texture to the bark. It's made of wood, different leaves, and so it has all these unique aspects to it. But the tree in itself is whole. It is the whole sense of the tree. When we look at a tree, our mind can kind of fragment it into parts. But I've never been a tree, but like I can assume a tree doesn't experience itself in parts. It experiences itself as one wholeness, if it experiences itself. You kind of get what I'm saying? It's it's one whole being. And can you imagine a tree that's kind of split off branches from itself? It's like, "Nah, I don't like this one about myself. I don't like that one. I need to fix this one. This one's traumatized and ugly. I don't like that branch, so I'm going to use all these different strategies to try and straighten it out." And so, can you see what happens to us is we turn into this tree that has kind of fragmented itself and turned on parts of itself. And so that happens through fundamentally childhood experiences. We have certain aspects of ourselves that arise that get repressed or orphaned or thrown away. And so returning to wholeness, a lot of people come on this journey with the kind of self-improvement mindset, but self-improvement is just another symptom of a disjointed and fragmented tree. Can you imagine the tree like, oh, I need to fix myself? Fixing ourselves is, I call it the trap of self-improvement, but self-improvement is always based on the idea that there's something wrong with us. There's something wrong with me as I am, and so I need to fix it. And that's a never-ending loop. Like, trust me, I was on that loop for a long time, and but integration and returning to wholeness is not about fixing anything. It's not about cutting off certain branches that we don't like or getting rid of aspects of ourselves. Because in my experience through working with people and trying everything with myself, that ends up perpetuating the wounds. Because what happens when you cut a branch off a tree? Like when you prune a fruit tree, it grows back with more vigor, quite quickly. And so a lot of these parts that, have fragmented off and been disowned, were done because of the lack of love. They weren't held in the presence of a compassionate witness, whether that be ourselves or someone else. They were rejected. And so the trap of self-improvement when it comes to integration, and that doesn't mean we don't improve our behaviors or improve how we relate to people or like that. I'm talking about the self, self-improvement. I need to better who I am on that fundamental level. We can still improve our lives and improve, the way we speak to people, our forms of communication, all of that sort of stuff, because that's not the self, But when these parts are included and held, in presence and witnessing and compassion, um, they become re-included, and so that's what integration means. Integration isn't like, oh, I need to get rid of these parts of myself or fix this aspect or these traits, etc. It's about inclusion. I find the word inclusion and integration almost synonymous in this context. And whereas self-improvement is essentially self-rejection in this context, because it's kind of like, well, if I keep rejecting this part of myself, and if all the work I'm doing is to try to get rid of these aspects, I'm doing the very thing to these parts that created them. Because if you think about it, like if if that is the orienting intention to get rid of this part, how can it integrate back into the whole? Because in that intention is the very pushing away of it that has kept it orphaned. And so, understanding our own kind of psychological dynamics, the way we relate to ourselves and the way we relate to our parts, it can be really fundamental in the process of allowing integration to happen, because integration is something that happens. It's not something that we do. What we can do is set the right environment for integration to occur more seamlessly. Because if you look at like, growing a vegetable garden, we can make sure the soil is rich in nutrients and the pH is right. We can ensure that, it gets enough water and we can plant the seeds. But do we actually grow the veggies? It's like you say, oh, I'm growing broccoli. But are you really? Like, are you growing the broccoli? No, no, the broccoli is actually growing itself. What you've done is created the right environment for the broccoli to grow in a kind of healthy and thriving way. So then you can reap the benefits afterwards. And integration is the same kind of thing. It's not something that we do, we don't integrate something, but we allow it to happen, and we can create the right environment, the right nurturing environment, the right attitude, and the right relationship to the part, just the same as the broccoli, the right relationship to the broccoli, the right environment for it to grow seamlessly and eventually, bear the fruits that we're looking for. And so integration is the same kind of thing. We can create the space, we can attune to ourselves and relate to ourselves in ways that aren't based on that self-rejection, but are based on that compassionate presence that all parts of ourselves need, with obviously kind of little unique differentiations there. But as we learn to allow, then transformation is something that occurs by itself. And if we start really fundamentally with understanding how am I relating to this part of myself, that's really fundamental. How am I relating to myself? How am I relating to the self that I experience myself as? How am I relating to this part of me that's fearful or angry or wounded? What's my fundamental relationship to it? If we start there and start to look at that relationship and then start to take the steps to maybe reorganize the different patterns and the different ways that we resist and push away the experience, then we're setting up the veggie patch for the broccoli to grow, like rather than starting with, try and grow a veggie patch with shit soil, not enough water, like it's bound to fail. And so if our whole healing journey is based on that idea of self-improvement, self-rejection, where I want to get rid of parts of myself. I need to fix myself. We're working with poor foundations. And so really understanding that relationship's fundamental and it's essential for things to actually integrate. Because integration means to return to the whole. It becomes back. It comes back. We're kind of like if you imagine a galaxy, and a sun in the middle, and all these fragmented parts coming out, they kind of return back through gravity. So, our being is pulling these parts of ourselves back. But it takes a lot of will, often unconsciously, to hold things at bay. Like we use the analogy holding a beach ball underwater, just squashing it down and holding it there all day. It actually takes a lot of will, and usually we're not even aware of um, the will that we're exerting to keep these parts at bay. But if we can learn to relax, to breathe, relax, witness, and be present, they actually just like gravity, like a sun would pull planets into itself. It just they come back home organically. But the process is one of building the capacity to experience them safely, because some things obviously are overwhelming, especially if it's on the end of the spectrum of trauma. Building the capacity to breathe, allow, and be present to what is.
Yeah, and someone in the above comments where was it spoke about, self-compassion, and that's so important in this because, one of our orientations with embodied processing that we have is there's an orientation that a practitioner would hold with a client, but we always encourage people to have this orientation with themselves as well, is that all is welcome here. So all parts of us are welcome here, and I welcome those parts in with compassion because as you do that little exercise on self that Matt took you through earlier, and someone commented up above, where was it? About, not feeling like they want to be in their body. And you'll find that the mind, you'll start to see these narratives or beliefs or ideas that something's missing after you go through well, I'm Ryan, I've got a son, and I've got Melissa, and I've got my business. Then all of a sudden you'll start to have this, I wish I looked different, or I wish I had more money, or I wish I had better relationships, or I wish this, I wish that. And so we have this idea that something is missing. And so then we have a part of ourselves that maybe wants us to look different or be more intelligent, or a part of us that maybe is anxious. And then we have a very adversarial relationship with that part of ourselves, which keeps it, like Matt said, it keeps it further away from us. Whereas if we can turn that around and go, oh, I wonder what this is, and welcome it in with compassion, we may not get all the answers straight away. And it may be difficult to sit with for a period of time, but we're now creating more of like we're on the same team with all these parts of ourselves, as opposed to hating some parts, liking other parts, because we can never truly be whole if we're like, well, I love all these bits of myself, but these bits I can't bloody stand, and we'll keep them over here and try not to ever show them to anyone, and wear a mask throughout our life. So I'm just having a look at some of the comments here. I just want to make sure that we're covering some of those. If you want to go through the comments, Matt, I'll talk about the next couple of dot points that we have here. If you want to have a look on that. So a lot about integration is that let's say we do a healing session, or we go away on retreat, or we just have a big experience where we have a big shift in perspective and we gain insights about ourselves and our past and the way we've been acting. I'm going to use the analogy of digesting again. We've taken in all this new information and we're now looking at a part of ourselves or looking at our life through a different lens and in a different way. So it's like we've taken in this new information that we need time to digest. It's not going to digest immediately. We have to go through that digestive process. And, if somebody, like I've had clients in session who um, realize that, for the past 30 years, they've been keeping people away and not letting them close because they don't want to get hurt based on early childhood experiences when they thought that they'd just been attracting, really negative people. That's a lot to take in. That's a lot to digest. That's a big meal for the digestive system and the psyche to be able to process. And so, like Matt said, we want to create then, and we'll go through this at the end of the call today, but we want to create favorable conditions for that information to be able to process. When you're talking about the garden, it was reminding me, I think Michael Singer, he was laughing at how parents say we made a baby. It's like you didn't make the baby. It's like you know what you did to start the process. But if you made the baby, go into that room and make me an eye. Bring me back an eye. And you can't do it because there's a greater intelligence that grows the baby. We just like to take ownership of that process. And so, like with the vegetable garden, yes, we can help the process and we can grow a healthier baby by having the conditions, healthier in a favorable condition. But we don't, make it or make this process happen. There's something much larger at play when it comes to integration.
Exactly, and it's like the best we can do is support it to happen. We can support it. But it's like, yeah, I often use that example. I didn't know Michael Singer said that too, but we like a mother doesn't grow a baby consciously with her will. I don't, and it's the same as like what grows a baby dog, a puppy, in the mum's belly. What grows a baby like a sheep, a baby cow, a calf, and it's like the same intelligence does it. It's the same as what grows broccoli, in the vegetable garden. But what we can do is create the right supportive environment. It's like I cut my hand, and I don't willfully make it to heal, but I create the right environment for healing to naturally occur. So everything is seeking wholeness already. And what we can do is cooperate or learn to cooperate with that process, and seeking wholeness is the same thing as integration. But just coming onto these questions, could we talk a little bit about original incident trauma and integration? And if you don't know what your original trauma is, how you could work with this. So through the felt sense, the mind kind of likes to want to have all the answers and know exactly where things came from, and find the original event. But sometimes the original event is symbolic, it can come in the form of like an image or a symbol. Sometimes it's just the visceral felt sense. A lot of my trauma initiated at birth, the birthing process. And that's not something I can consciously remember, with my mind. I don't get a memory of being born. But what I do get is a visceral felt sense of what that was like. And so as we enter the felt sense, and the more we do this kind of work, the more we actually learn to trust our body. It's like, in the example of like cutting my hand, I don't have to know all the ins and outs for my hand for my wound to heal. I don't even have to know how I did it. Imagine someone's like massively drunk, blackout drunk, and cuts their leg open, and then the next morning has no idea how they cut their leg. If they create the right environment, that wound will still heal without the input of the mind or the cognitive understanding of the mind. Even though, cognitive understanding can be helpful and satisfying, for the mind itself, like to actually know what's going on. But to either way, we can help create the supportive environment and we can help relate to this part of ourselves to in a healthy way that is supportive of healing. And be aware of as I was saying earlier, our relationship to it, because it can come in such subtle ways, this kind of fix it mentality. Oh, I can want to know the original trauma because I figured that if I find it, then I'll be able to actually like get in and get rid of this part once and for all. I'm not saying that's what you're doing, Rachel, but it's just for everyone listening. It can just be a little subtle trap, how the mind works, why it wants to know these things. And so inquiry into that, can be helpful. How is it that I'm relating to this part of myself? And can we shift that? It's like, okay, it's okay to be here. It's okay for you to be here. And we can start with that kind of dialogue. And something I used to ask myself, and it's kind of a question to know. I used to ask it to kind of gauge my level of surrender. Is it okay if this is here forever? Or is it okay if this never goes away? And if the answer was no, I knew that I was still unconsciously in some form of resistance to it, and then I'd look at that resistance. The next question, I think, Ryan, you'll be good at covering. It's on uh, if you have breath holding spells, nervous system disorder in young children, where the child is upset, frustrated, and their nervous system forces their breath to stop until they lose consciousness. In your opinion, would this be causal or symptomatic of integration issues? I think, you do a good job at explaining like what happens when animals feign death and the dorsal kind of response.
Yeah, I would say symptomatic, if that's the question. Is that a particular disorder? I can't scroll up to see the comment, but
Yeah, they named the disorder. Where was it? Dysautonomia. Sorry, might have pronounced that
yeah,
wrong.
yeah, okay. Yeah, it reminds me everyone's different and everyone's subjective, and that's why, we don't particularly like labels and diagnosis a hell of a lot in the work that we do. But it reminds me of an example. All of these responses tend to come in a way for the organism to cope at a certain period in their life with extreme stress. So Matt was referring to I think in the course, our nervous system is constantly trying to analyze our environment to determine if there's threat or the absence of threat. If it detects there's threat, then it will go into a nervous system state that it deems is best for our survival in that moment. And so those states are the sympathetic branch of the nervous system, which is fight or flight. This is where the organism gets mobilized to move in some way. So lots of energy flows to the body for either to fight back at whatever the perceived threat is, or run away. So flight or flee, whatever the perceived threat is. A nervous system can also go into a dorsal vagal without getting too technical, which is a shutdown response, where it deems that actually shutting down the body in that moment is the best way for us to survive. And there's a wonderful video online. If you just search on YouTube, it's like Impala, cheetah, feigning death, something like that. You'll be able to search it, you'll find it. And you'll see this in action where actually there's an impala and it gets captured by a leopard. And basically, it goes into a complete shutdown state. Its nervous system does. So it goes completely floppy. Its breath slows down so much to where it stops breathing, or it's not perceivable to see it breathing, as the leopard is taking it away in its jaws to wherever it's going to consume the impala. On the way, the leopard gets distracted. I believe it's by another leopard. So it drops the impala on the ground and looks around to assess its environment. So its nervous system going into a state as well. And it wanders off to go and inspect what's happening over on the other side of the field. In that moment, you'll see the impala come out of the shutdown response in the nervous system by taking massive breaths and shaking, and it comes out of that shutdown response into an activated flight response. It's just a wonderful example of how a nervous system shifts states, and it's able to flee and get away. And the leopard comes back and is like, "Oh, where's my lunch?" And it's completely gone. So, in terms of this particular scenario with the child here, I mean, the time that I've seen this is I had a client many years ago, and I'm not saying that this is why I mentioned everything's subjective and it would need to be explored that way. But I had a client who had a similar thing in their childhood and they still had a similar thing into adulthood. And when we did a session and explored it, we found out that during their birth, they were born with the cord wrapped around their neck and they were suffocating. And so they had had this sort of suffocation reflex happening ever since their moment of birth into adulthood, which, we then have to obviously work through and navigate. But whenever their body was presented with a certain type of stress, it would go into that particular response again. So we were able to kind of find the origins of that. Not to say this is going to be the same origins, but generally what you're describing is going to be symptomatic of a stress response which was created somewhere. I would say generally in infants, so before the age of 2 at some time.
Katrina has a question, just if someone we're working with has no ability to be compassionate with themselves or for an orphan part, yet compassion is essential for accepting the part and integrating it, how can we help the person to have compassion for themselves? So that's something that, can has to be its own development. We talk a lot in EP about stage one trauma work versus stage two, and stage two is really about the gentle processing and integration of trauma and of orphan parts as it exists within the body and mind. But stage one work is really the preparation for that. And so understanding our relationship to things can be really important as a stage one, as a foundational approach. Developing the capacity for self-compassion. It can be a slow process. I've worked with many people that your description would fit to perfectly, but just little moments. And the more someone experiences a compassionate presence externally as well, the easier it is for that to become internalized. So the relational dynamic between the practitioner and the client is really essential, because it's like as a child, we internalize the relationship that our parents have to us and have to these parts of ourselves. And so, if they've never experienced what someone looking at them with empathic eyes or a compassionate presence is like, how would we expect them to be able to do it to themselves? They've never had that experience. And if they were to do it to themselves, they'd be making up what it's actually like, because it's not something that they've ever experienced. It's like asking someone who's never eaten a strawberry, well, you got to work out what a strawberry tastes like. Well, they can't, like, because they've never had it, like they've never experienced it. And so that relational dynamic between practitioner and client, us holding a compassionate space of presence for them, there's a kind of osmosis resonance kind of transmission that happens with that as well. And over time, like I'm not going to pretend it's a slow process and they're going to develop self-compassion in, you know, 3 sessions. Buy 3 sessions off me and you'll be perfectly self-compassionate. Like, no, it's not true. Maybe for someone who already has that capacity, had, somewhat of a healthy attachment, etc. But for someone who's never had it, never experienced it, it can be a slow process to develop and learn to relate to ourselves in new ways. And Gemma's comment is great, psychoeducation about how these parts were created, why they're there. They were just trying to protect you. So Gemma said, I found that seeing the barriers, wounds, and trauma as a survival strategy can be helpful with integration because that understanding can then elicit a feeling of gratitude for the part. So welcoming the protective part then becomes a natural aspect of that gratitude. So psychoeducation, really teaching someone, educating them how these parts were created, why they were created. They were created to help you survive um, abnormal circumstance, stressful circumstance, and you can do exercises with them like, well, how has this part actually helped you? How has it served you? Because their attention can be so focused on how it's damaging them and how it's hurt them. But to actually change their relationship to it, we can look at questions like that, well, what's good about it? It's like, so I was a heroin addict for many years, over a decade. And it's a question I've asked myself, well, how did heroin serve me? And I look back, it's like it saved my life. Like I would have killed myself, from the level of suffering that I was in if I didn't have it. I used to say heroin's like a big hug from mum. That's what it was. Like I'd have heroin and it felt like sitting by the fire and with a blanket wrapped around you and mum's home, that feeling of warmth, of like maternal holding. That's what it would give me. And essentially, it kept my trauma at a manageable level, for over a decade. It was the only way I could cope with it. And so I looked, and that's not often a thing that people do is like, what's the positive aspect to it? And so I was able to start to relate to my addiction in a different way. And through that, I developed self-compassion for, everything I did and a whole lot of compassion for other addicts, who were going through similar things. Like, because I can see, wow, this is what they're doing, the same thing that I was doing in different ways. And so there's lots of different ways that we can approach this, but it comes back to that fundamental thing I said at the start is making the relationship, the current relationship that we're having to this part conscious, and then starting to utilize strategies to reorient how we're approaching it, how we're relating to it.
Yeah. And if it's with I'm not sure if it was a client or maybe a friend or loved one they're talking about, but yeah, we have to be compassionate for them even when they can't be compassionate for themselves. And I had a client reach out to me. It was an old client only a couple of weeks ago. Hadn't heard from them in a while, and they just messaged me and just said thank you. And I'm like, what for? Haven't heard from you in ages. And they're like, you had compassion or you loved me or the parts of me at a time when I couldn't love myself. And so, and we can only, you can't fake that either. It's like everyone on this call, you're probably an expert at it. That's the whole reason you sign up for a workshop like this. Once you understand what we're talking about today, you can look at every other human being with compassion because you can understand they all have suffering, imprints, orphaned parts. They have all of this stuff going on that they're consciously or unconsciously just trying to manage. And so it's very easy to be able to look at someone with that compassion. And if you can do that for the other person without the expectation that they're then instantly magically going to have compassion for themselves, I think, via osmosis and co-regulation over time, and especially if they're getting that in other areas as well, then they can start to have compassion for themselves. But like Matt said, it's so foreign. This particular client that I had that reached out, they never experienced compassion from either of their caregivers or anybody their entire life growing up. And when that happens, when we become an adult, a lot of people can be very sus or untrustworthy when they receive compassion from another because they'll assume that the person's trying to get something from them or it's fake or it's about to be taken away. So a lot of trust needs to be built for someone to start to first accept compassion from another human being before even having that compassion for themselves or especially the parts of themselves that they maybe don't like looking at or experiencing.
Yeah, and it's like, compassion is an essential quality for integration. It's like, having good soil, um, to be able to compassionately witness and understand ourselves and these parts of ourselves. It's like, what else could be more inclusive than that? It's like it's the opposite to rejection. Someone mentioned they were to told to look at themselves with curiosity. Curiosity is another really essential quality. Like, what is this? I want to get to know it versus I want to get rid of this. I don't like it. You know, so having that fundamental attitude shift is really important. There's lots of questions. I'm finding it hard to kind of keep up
Yeah,
with them.
yeah. We'll keep
But
going with what the dot points that we'll cover, and we might come back to a few.
we'll
Just
do our best.
one. Yeah, we'll do our best. One of them is just we want to touch on just the traps, or really the main trap when it comes to integration. Matt's kind of touched on it already, but it's just wanting the integration process to be done when it's not ready to be done yet. It's like wanting the broccoli to be ready to be cut and eaten when it's not ready yet. And I see people doing this or keep going back and having healing sessions. Or I saw a great example years ago. Was researching, plant medicines and psychedelics because I was interested in their possible utility for addiction treatment and all of that. So I went and did an ayahuasca ceremony 7 or 8 years ago now. And I remember rocking up and you'd meet the people and you'd share your intention and all that. And there was this one guy there who was talking to me, and I said, "Oh, how many times?" He sounded quite experienced, and I'm like, "How many times have you done this?" And he goes, "Oh, this would be, I think, 18 or 19." And then when he was sharing his, intention, he said, "Oh, I'm here because this is the only place that, I feel safe. And out there, the people annoy me and I hate them and they make me angry and all that." And whilst I was very compassionate and sad for him, I'm like, I don't feel like he's taking anything that he's learning here back into the real world. Because why do we do a plant medicine? Why do we do a healing session? Why do we go away on retreat? It's because we want to, why do we do sauna, cold therapy? Why do we exercise? Because we want our actual day-to-day life on a moment-to-moment basis have some sort of benefit there. We want to feel better in some way. And so if we're not integrating and just going back to the experience, then we struggle to, I guess, be where we want to be in our life. And I remember we had, um, at the center, we're running the center and we're training up our first staff member and we're training her up in root cause therapy. Shout out to Chanel. And whilst she was doing her practicing, she was doing her practicing on me. And so I was getting about like 4 sessions a week for about 3 weeks straight of root cause therapy. And I got to week 3 and I just tapped out and I said, Chanel, you're going to have to find someone else because there's not, one of those sessions may have needed a couple of weeks of integration to happen. But just by going back and under the premise of trying to train our new practitioner, I realized the real futility in trying to do more, without really honoring this integration process. And so sometimes with clients, or if I'm a client in some context, even if I'm booked in for a weekly, a fortnightly, or a monthly session, if I sense in myself or if I can sense in the client that they haven't fully integrated what came up in the last session, we may just spend that session sort of going over and exploring and somatically experiencing where they're at in that integration process with what we worked on last week, instead of them, jumping into something else. And I've had clients say, "Yep, last week's session was good, but I've got this, really heavy trauma from when I was 6 years old, and I want to do that today." And sometimes we have to say, "Well, let's just check in first. Let's see if our body is ready for us to jump into that, or if we need to take it a bit more gently and integrate what we've been doing up until this point." Because the definition of trauma from Peter Levine is too much, too soon, and without my consent. And so we have to think about that in a re-traumatization in a client practitioner context, in that sometimes the client wants to go heavier, but we need to do a little bit more integrating before we jump into that.
It's like nature can be such a good teacher for this. Like less is more, often when it comes to healing, especially with developmental trauma in general, because it's like you watch a tree grow or a plant grow, like it's not in a rush, it's not pumping the accelerator to kind of get there, like get grown. No, it's more of kind of like for us as humans, it's more a learning to soften into. Because if we look at that kind of, and it's such a Western thing, like go, 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 like let's fucking get this done, like use our will. Like I'm gonna just spend the next year just pumping trauma therapy. I'm gonna get through it, and then like I'll get a like first place prize.
Fast track it. I'm going to do it faster than anyone's ever done it. What's the
Yeah,
record?
yeah, exactly. And it's like that actual orientation is such a sympathetic energy, and often is a symptom of our cultural trauma in itself, but like it's like I'm just gonna fully integrate everything in the next 6 months, but it doesn't work that way, What we're doing then, it's like we're in a car pumping the brake and the accelerator at the same time. and so we don't go anywhere. All we do is burning the engine. And I see people approach, healing with that same kind of attitude, and it's so well ingrained, and that's like the fix it mentality also. It's like I'm just going to fix myself and become this perfect human, and we end up chasing these ideals that don't exist, whereas the kind of opposite is needed. We need to learn to slow down, soften, like the out breath, like, and it's my intention and orientation, if I have stuff coming up, and I still do, and get sessions when I need to. It's like my orientation is always like, okay, m my process is to be with this part. How can I learn to hold this part and be with it? That's the fundamental question. That's the approach. Like presence. How can I be present to this part, and allow it? Because it's like through so many repeated experiences, it's like it happens on its own in its own time, just like a tree grows in its own time. You can't will it to grow, just like, you can't will the cut to grow. But what you can do is soften and learn to allow that deeper intelligence to take over. And so, if we can learn to ride the waves and be present to that kind of contraction of stress, and then the relaxation of regulation, contract and relax. Peter Levine uses those big balls, that my son's got one that you're just kind of pulling it out. We call it the breathing ball, but where you can learn to be present to and soften in the midst of that contraction and expansion process. The nervous system starts to integrate and re-regulate itself. And that's a practice. It's something, it's kind of meditative in a way. We can learn to live as a meditation where our process is learning to be present and conscious to what is, and bring our own consciousness, our own present moment awareness to whatever it is that we're experiencing. And that over time becomes unconditional. It becomes the unconditional presence that everything needs to integrate back into now. So everything that we're becoming present to is a repetition, a reenactment of something of the past. And by bringing presence to it, it kind of transforms the timestamp of the past into present moment experiencing.
Beautifully said. Just through the comments here, when a child feels hateful towards their dysregulation, how can this be shifted so they feel compassion? That takes time, and it comes from the caregiver or people who are around them. The way that normal sort of Western society works is the child gets dysregulated. The child does not have the ability to self-regulate. They have to learn it from a relational dynamic. So they become dysregulated. That then dysregulates the parents, and now we're co-regulated in dysregulation. Then the child normally gets abandoned in a certain emotional state. So if, let's say it's anger, go away, come back, go into timeout and come back when you're not angry anymore. So we're abandoned in the emotion of anger, which leads us over time to abandon ourselves in the emotion of anger. That's why so many adults have issues with suppressed anger, because it was abandoned when we were a child. And so that's sort of the cycle of dysregulation, so to speak. If we can work on ourselves, learn all this stuff, practice regulating ourselves, then the parent can, to the best of their ability, and you'll never get it perfect. Parenting's not about being perfect, but you will better be able to stay regulated and present whilst the child is dysregulated. Okay. So then instead of dysregulation and dysregulation matching, then you have dysregulation and regulation. And so if you can hold that regulated state as best you can, remain compassionate for the child, then over the weeks, months, and years, that can start to bleed into the child's being. But it takes a lot of time because, yeah, children have to learn to regulate.
It comes back to what I was saying earlier, that practitioner client relationship. It applies even more so, thousandfold with children.
Yeah, our nervous systems are always communicating, and you'll know that you might have that friend that you go out with coffee for coffee with, and you always just feel so mellow and relaxed afterwards. Then there's that other friend, and you feel really chaotic and agitated afterwards. It's because you've gone in and started to co-regulate your nervous systems by being around that other person, and it's always happening in the parent-child dynamic. what else was here? Jennifer is saying, yeah, great example. I had a client with 10 sessions of EP and they said it's done more good than the last 20 years of therapy. And we only worked on one thing. So it's one thing that's obviously, gone over, taken time, worked on, explored, then re-explored, integrated. So that's a wonderful example. Thanks for that, Jen. And then Deb's just talking about, yeah, like students trying to get certified really quick and rush their way through it. We had a client, not a client, a student, and I loved their journey because they took a good year and a half to 2 years. And I remember they were working through embodied processing and the material brought up a lot. So they'd gone through the material, started practice sessions. Then because it brought up so much, they went away and worked on themselves and got sessions, took time to integrate that, came back to the course, finished up all their sessions, re-went through the material and ended up getting certified after 18 months or so. And they were, I could tell from their assessment session were wonderful and such, in a good space themselves because they took longer. And as was it Lily up higher said, where would be the fun in that? Like rushing it, like take your time. It's okay.
It's such a cultural thing, it's embedded
Got
in
to
our
get it
culture.
done.
And
Got to
it's
get
like
it done.
yeah, it serves the economy and it serves, the systems that we live in, but it doesn't serve us, it doesn't
Yeah.
serve our biology, it doesn't serve our mental health. It's like nothing else in nature is doing it. It's
Damien asked a great question. How do we know when a part is truly integrated? Um, Two examples. Number one, so the example I gave right at the start of me in grade two putting my hand up and then deciding that it's not safe to speak up. I'll know when that part is integrated because life will show me when I can walk in to speak to my partner and express my needs and have that conversation with her that I was unable to before, then I will know that's integrated. There's also like layers of integration, like it can be a process. There's four levels of learning, or this works really well with sort of integration as well. And that's unconscious incompetence, conscious incompetence, conscious incompetence, and unconscious competence. That's a real mouthful, but I'll explain them both. So the top one's unconscious incompetence. So it's basically we have a blind spot. We have this issue going on where I can't speak up because I don't feel like it's safe, but I have no awareness of it. I don't know. Then I come to a class like this or I'm learning something and then I realize I'm like, holy crap, I've got this thing called an orphan part. It's a split off part of my psyche and my being. And it means that I always feel not safe to speak up. And I didn't know other people didn't feel that way. I thought I was just wrong or strange. So now I'm conscious of my incompetence. I then go into a session and I uncover the core wounding of grade two when I put my hand up and I explore that somatically. I start to process the emotions of fear and shame and embarrassment. And I realize that I had no resources at that time, but I can be that resource for myself right now. And that I created that idea and that narrative about the world in that moment that I've carried for the past 30 years. So now I'm conscious of my competence. So maybe from there we can do a session and that activation, as Damien said in the message, that activation may be gone. But what happens, we have this phase, the conscious competence, where maybe the activation's still there to a degree. But now that I know where it comes from and there's a belief behind it and all these emotions, I still go ahead and I do it anyway. Even though it's scary and I want to pull away, I'll still have those difficult conversations and express my need and I'll speak up. And now that phase will last for a certain period of time, could be a week, could be a year. And then we'll move into this unconscious competence phase where now it's no longer a conscious process. I don't have to think about it. I don't have to exert my will to go and express my needs and speak up. It just happens naturally. And I guess that's the closing or the ending of the integration experience. But a lot of people trip up at that third phase where they have to, feel the fear or feel the agitation or feel the dysregulation, but do it anyway. But that actually builds resilience, and builds resilience in us knowing that even though it feels scary and a little bit unsafe, we can still go ahead and step over that and step into whatever we're trying to do. There's also, I think, I'm thinking back. So it was about 10 years ago that I had an experience in session that changed my life, and I uncovered that I truly hated who I was as a human being. And because of that, I used drugs and alcohol to try and escape myself as best I could. And, I integrated something very quickly in that session because I stopped using drugs from that day forward. So something integrated and I took the next step in my life. But if I'm being honest, I'm still integrating that experience, a decade later. And I remember the months preceding that experience, I had such a sort of mystical high experience and it felt so good that I remember I was like, I've got to try and get back there. And so, then I had to actually integrate the experience or the grieving of going, maybe you'll never get back there. And even if you do get back there, that's not a place that you live in as long as you're in this human body. So I had this initial integration. I had this maybe 3 month long integration of giving up the hope of feeling like I'm connected to everyone 100% all of the time, all over the universe. And then if I'm honest, I'm still integrating, the aspect of wanting to abandon myself or not love myself. Because in little moments, I'll notice that, creep up a little bit and go, well, I love all of this over here, but not when I'm like that. So if I'm being honest, I'm still integrating that experience from 10 years ago. But that's a great thing because I mean, even that first level of integration saw a massive change in my life, one of not destroying myself through the use of drugs and alcohol. So it's okay for the integration process to have layers and take time and whatever it needs to be.
Yeah, it's kind of like integration. It's not, and look, like it depends what it is. We can have an experience, and it kind of metabolizes and integrates in the moment that it happens, But when it comes to, and people usually have this question when it comes to more developmental trauma, where things have been reenacted over and over again and have specific traits and qualities that have embedded themselves into the personality, into the person's actual ego structure. And so, those kind of things can be so complex and we can integrate layers of it at a time. You might have heard that kind of saying that healing is a spiral. We kind of come back and meet deeper layers of the same parts of ourselves. And so, I've never found like a universal trait that happens or quality that when integration occurs, that everyone experiences. As Damien said, it's very subjective. Sometimes things have just integrated without me knowing, and it's only in hindsight, and it's like a year later, I look back, it's like, wow, that hasn't popped up at all. And I'm on the next thing, and I've been just softening and being with whatever's has been coming up as the next layer of the same thing or something completely different. And so, sometimes I've had like a big catharsis, without losing that sense of presence. Catharsis by itself, can be unhelpful, but if we can stay present to it whilst it's happening, and then afterwards that part has gone and integrated. Um, Not gone, but kind of it's strange because the parts can transmute into more essential qualities, like rage. Rage is something that I've had to work with for a long time, within myself, childhood generational trauma, and it was just so embedded in my nervous system and the repression tactics that I had to hold it at bay and the terror that was on top. And it's like we could look at that whole structure as a part, a generational trait. My dad's got it. And so learning to actually be with it, learning to move it through the rage itself, like first the terror, like learning to be really present to the terror that was there, and then learning to be really present to the shame and doing all the things we spoke about today, like understanding my resistances and changing my relationships to them, and then like hitting this layer of rage. The rage started to actually transform and feel like it was my sense of power, my sense of being boundaried, my ability to say no. I didn't realize it like that, but I found it really hard to say no my whole life, and I thought I was some big tough gangster, but like I had no ability to say no or have boundaries or anything like that. And so when someone would ask me to do something, I'd go into a kind of crippling fear, like, if I didn't want to, if my gut was saying no, and that was, my childhood, like I wasn't allowed to say no to my parents, especially my dad. And so that created this layer of rage. But then as I started to learn to feel the rage, the integration occurred kind of gradually over time, kind of like an erosion. And sometimes it felt like water eroding a rock. It just felt so dense and so much of it. But over time, it started to transform into power, and I started to see the results in different relationships. Like I was able to actually say no to my dad, no to my mum, have boundaries, say no to things that I didn't want to do. And I started to see the result from that process of learning to be present to it in my daily life. And so I can't pinpoint where integration happened. It was more like an erosion, or a like watching a tree grow. At what point do you say, well, that tree's fully grown? Like you can't, because it's always doing something and transforming in some form of way, some way. And so, I feel like in my experience, a lot of the work that I've done has been that same kind of thing, like no end point. It's like evolution. It just continues to refine itself and keep integrating and reach more and more levels of holding. Exactly as Damien just said, building capacity with ongoing integration, always unfolding. Spot on. I could have just said that basically.
Yeah, that actually ties into I saw a question earlier in the comments. I'm having trouble keeping up now. It's
Yeah,
very
yeah,
active in there. It's great.
right.
It's awesome. Lots of EP love as well, which is very humbling. Um, about if you're at the conscious competence phase and then another trigger comes up with another belief and another part and that becoming too much. One thing we teach in embodied processing is that building of capacity. And what is building of capacity? It's my capacity to be with this present moment. And that present moment not just includes what's happening right here, but whatever thoughts and emotions and beliefs are happening from my past or my ideas about the future as well. And as my capacity is the container within which I can hold that experience. So a lot of times when people come into this work, we have so much stored stress and trauma and imprints and emotional baggage within our body, and it's really big. And our capacity to deal with that, just because we haven't been taught the resources, is very small. And that's why it doesn't take much to go into a very, very overwhelmed state. It can just be, someone not taking the bins out or someone looking at us a funny way, and we completely go into a dysregulated state. But over time, as we go into this work, and this is part of the integration process, it's growing in that capacity. So we're more and more able to be with this present moment, whatever it's showing us. And at that same time, we're also working through that stored stress that in the body somatically that we've accumulated throughout a lifetime. I like to think of it as a set of scales. So over time, those scales are going from one side to the other, to the point where we become very, very resilient in the fact that we feel like we can handle everything. We know that we're human and life's going to throw all sorts of shit at us and it's not going to be perfect and easy and all that. But we feel like we have the capacity that we're going to deal with whatever comes our way. We feel very resilient and we have a large container to do that. So whether it's one, two, three, five, 10 different triggers and that happening at the one time, it takes practice and it takes time, but eventually when we have the capacity to hold that, we kind of feel bulletproof to an extent, which is really nice. So we might now, Matt, just talk about just some of the elements of we can help, whether it's in ourselves or if we're working with clients, some of the elements to aid with integration, I guess, create that fertile ground for growing the integration broccoli. Um, the first and foremost is one that we touched on earlier. It's just we have to have the attitude that we're going to turn towards these parts and not away from them. We've abandoned them mostly unconsciously for most of our lives. We have to change that orientation if we're going to properly integrate them. So, if I've worked on something in session, let's say it's a mother wound or something there, then in the days, weeks that precede that, whenever that mother mood starts to come up, maybe I see something on TV of someone interacting with their mother or mum calls or messages me and I go into that heightened state. Am I going to disown and push that part of me away because all the feelings feel uncomfortable? Or am I going to take a deep breath and go, even though that's my natural inclination, I'm going to choose a different way. I'm going to choose to turn toward that and hold this as best I can, because that is going to help that integration or that digestion process greatly. Another one there is rest, especially, post a big experience in those couple of days after. It's very important. I always tell clients, like, care for yourself as if you were caring for a sick or ill loved one, essentially. So a lot of people want to have a massive experience that really completely shatters their idea about themselves and the world that they've been holding for decades. And they want to quickly go and, go to work. and get really busy and finish this assignment and run off and get stuck in the hamster wheel of life. It's important that we care for ourselves as if we're a sick loved one, be very gentle with ourselves and make sure we're looking after ourselves. Things like hydration, nutrition, looking after our body, because the more resilient our like physical and biological body is, the more resilient we're going to be and better able to integrate these experiences of the psyche and the mind and the nervous system. Journaling, is a great one for a lot of people. If you're not a writer, you can like leave yourself voice notes and things like that. But whatever's coming up, because oftentimes when we have a huge experience, that can show up, if not in our thoughts on a day-to-day basis, but it can show up in dreams. So I have clients all the time reaching out going, you wouldn't believe the dream I had last night. And it might seem random, but it's oftentimes very symbolic of something that we've worked through, a new insight that has been gained. So being able to sort of journal or get the whole idea of that is to get something out, get it out of our mind and down onto paper or into a voice note or something like that. Spending time outside in nature, very, very important. Nature, I heard nature described as a vitamin the other day, like an essential vitamin. I couldn't agree more. Like spending as much time in nature as we can. I recommend clients go for hikes or just spend time, meditating or whatever, doing some Tai Chi or Qigong out in the bush, as we would call it here in Australia. But really just getting out in nature and soaking all that has to offer in. I know, Matt lives in kind of a regional part of Victoria, a lot of nature around. I've recently moved to a place with a lot of greenery and trees and everything, and I can feel the difference, even just in my day-to-day life. So it's even more important when integrating. Creativity is a big one. Creativity is something that most adults have abandoned. We were creative as kids, but we've grown up and become very analytical and process driven in our mind. And we have our little checklists and things to do every day, and we've lost the ability to be creative. So I always encourage clients in whatever form that creativity takes, whether it is art, drawing, music, whatever it might be, to start to tap into that again and express that. Because that helps balance us out as a human being as well. And creativity, this is why art therapy is so popular and can be so effective for people. When you're combining creativity with also working through this stuff from our past, then it can be very, very powerful. Any to add there, Matt? Anything else you might recommend to clients that maybe isn't what I've already spoken
No,
about?
anything that helps to regulate, anything that kind of fosters that slowing down, softening into, allowing the integration process to happen.
Yeah, and just relationally as well. It's having those resources. I spoke again about me in grade two, putting my hand up and didn't have the resources, that safe space to talk about what was going on in here. We want to create that for our lives as well. And whether that's, a friend, a family member, whether we have that practitioner that we can reach out to and have that safe space to speak about, because it's important that we have these safe spaces where we can take off the mask and truly express what's going on for us. And that's why a lot of people do get benefit early on just with talk therapy. We speak about, bottom up stuff and somatic work and all that. But, talk therapy can be very beneficial at the start because people are all of a sudden talking about stuff that they've been holding in for, 5, 10, 20 years. Now, we obviously want to work a bit deeper than that, but that's obviously a great space to have when integrating. Just being able to talk openly and honestly and in a way that we probably wouldn't normally do with friends or work colleagues or anything like that. So we very much heal relationally. And that's why we spoke about compassion a lot and having compassion for others and ourselves. So that's very important as well. All right. We might wrap it up there, Matt. It's about an hour and 20.
Gone over the time, that's all right. So
Yeah.
sorry if I didn't get to your questions. 120 something people were in here, so it was
Yeah.
hard to keep up with everything.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things I will finish up on. The first of all is Melissa is doing her talk on integration tomorrow, same time tomorrow. So please jump on that. It's a different Zoom link to my one, so it'll be in your emails. You'll have the Zoom link for tomorrow. It's a different one. You'll also get a reminder with that Zoom link in it as well. So keep an eye out for that. You'll also get an email with the replay of today and tomorrow. And a couple more things. I'm going to share some links here in the chat box before we jump off. For anyone not in any of our practitioner trainings, I know we have a bunch of practitioners on the call today that I can recognize. We have a sale starting on Wednesday, but we're going to release it to you today if you want to jump in. And it's a bundle sale. So anyone who's interested in saving heaps of money on enrollment on our courses at the minute, we're bundling up a lot of our programs, our certification programs. I've just popped the link in the chat box, so please feel free to jump in that. I'm pretty sure the link will get emailed to you today as well. And just one more link for anyone down here, down under in Melbourne, Australia. We have a networking event slash conference coming up next month, and I've just popped that in the chat box there. So anybody who's around in May in Melbourne, Australia, we would love to see you in person. We're going to do some talks there. I'm going to be there. Matt's going to be there. Melissa's going to be there. Noel's going to be there. So we're going to have quite a turnout there. So anyone in Melbourne who's coming along to that, I can't wait to see you and just give you a big hug. That's what I love about the in-person stuff. It's the best. It's the big hug and that real human connection. I love all the stuff on Zoom and I love connecting with people all around the world. But that's probably another one where with integration, having those spaces, whether it's not one-on-one, having those groups or things that you can do, those activities that can help our soul, so to speak. Someone just asked if the conference will be recorded. We will be recording it. I don't think we'll be streaming it live. But we also are holding a bigger conference slash retreat later in the year, which Melissa and I just met with an event organizer up in Queensland, Australia, who's currently sourcing locations for us. So we're going to have more details in the coming weeks on that, probably be September or October to give people time to book. But that'll be a 2 or 3 day kind of retreat event thing, which we would love to see you at if you can make it. All right. Great turnout. Great to see all your beautiful smiling faces. Wherever you are in the world, have a beautiful day, a beautiful evening. Don't forget to tune in to Melissa tomorrow. Any questions, just reach out, Ryan at thecenterforhealing.com.au if you want to reach out to me privately. I'm happy to have a chat and answer any questions that you have. And that's it.
Thanks, everyone.
See ya.
Yeah, thank you. Bye bye.